Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Cunning House, for inviting me to talk to you this afternoon. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to be here this morning, so I apologize in advance if I repeat anything that's already been said. Let me start by saying that I think this is a very good moment to have this kind of event in London. But I think that the terms of diplomatic and commercial trade, as it were, between Britain and Latin America have changed in the last decade. And sorry about, I'll get the commercial out of the way at the beginning. No? but as they say in Brazil, tenho que vender o meu peixe. I have to sell my fish. I think the message we were trying to get across in this cover is that this is in many ways a different Latin America to the one of 10 or 20 years ago, which doesn't mean that it still doesn't have many of the problems of 10 or 20 years ago. But it's a much more self-confident place and occupies a more important role in a changed world. And the past decade has been very good for Latin America. It grew, as you can see, from that part of the chart that looks like a large molar towards the right-hand end. It had 5 years of growth averaging 5.5%. It sailed through the recession on the whole fairly well, although there were variations across the region, and there was a strong recovery since then. Now, why has it done so much better? Well, broadly two sets of factors. Much better economic policies than in the past, firstly, and secondly, favourable conditions in the world economy, especially the commodity super cycle that has been triggered by the industrialization of China and India and the effect that's had on Latin America's export prices, which you've heard about this morning, I think. And in addition, liquidity has been abundant and cheap in the world, and that for a region that still doesn't save enough to finance its own development is important. So the net effect of those two factors, commodities and liquidity, has been to remove the balance of payments constraint that condemned Latin America to stop-go volatility for decades. In the place of that, we've had a virtuous circle of growth, poverty reduction, stability, domestic credit expansion, and more self-confident democracies with better social programs. And you can see there that between 2003 and 2008, some 40 million Latin Americans on national poverty line definitions left poverty behind. And the recession really didn't make much of an impact on that, except in Central America and Mexico. And at last, inequality has been falling in Latin America as well. And it's been Latin America's sad and notorious distinction that it has the most unequal income distribution in the world, and has had for many decades. But at last, the trend is starting to reverse. I mean, it still remains very unequal. I mean, most countries in Europe have Gini coefficients in the 30s, for example. But at least it's moving in the right direction, and that's important. As a result of these trends, you will have heard perhaps quite a lot of talk about a new middle class in Latin America. And that's significant, but I think it's important not to get carried away. Many of these people are still, by most definitions, poor, but they're less poor than they were. As Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who as well as being a former president of Brazil is a great sociologist, has pointed out, class is a question not just of income, but also of education, social status, and social capital. On what I think is the most realistic definition of middle class, in a study on the subject of in Latin America, which is one done by the Brookings Institution a few months ago. And they define middle class as households with daily expenditures of between $10 and $100. And that is a global standard. They find that in 2005, around 36% of Latin Americans were in that category. One can assume it's a bit over 40% now. So it shows that there's been a big advance, but it's, I think, too optimistic to suggest that the whole continent is middle class. But clearly there is a much bigger consumer market than there was. The total value of Latin America's imports has increased 2.5 times since 2002, from $358 billion to almost $900 billion last year. And at the same time, there's been gradual but cumulative improvements in both public and private infrastructure. And one sees that wherever one goes in Latin America, in the form of kind of new shopping centers, new roads, new parks. And I would add that I think that one of the structural factors behind poverty in parts of the region is remoteness. It's not being part of the market, not being close to the market. And I think that telecommunications are changing that. I think 80% of Latin Americans now have cell phones, and that does make a difference. It makes a difference in some of the poorest places in the Peruvian Andes, for example. And lastly, I think, in a way, this chart says it all. The conquest of inflation has changed Latin Americans' lives, and it means that instead of having to think about today, you can think about tomorrow. Instead of having to think about how much less you have in your pocket than you had this morning, you can think about what you're going to do with your money next year. So credit and mortgages and so on have come back. And the result of that is that there are more and more Latin Americans like this couple, who for me symbolize the new Latin America. They're mestizo, they have just taken possession of their first owner-occupied house with their first ever mortgage, and they're aspirational. And there's a lot of people like that in the region. Now, I think the next few years are unlikely to be as favorable because of the circumstances in the outside world. And there are two big risks. One is that despite the efforts of early this morning, Messrs. Merkel and Sarkozy don't manage to implement an effective, sufficiently effective package of measures to isolate the impact of the Greek default from the rest of the European financial system. If they don't manage to do that, then there is a risk, a danger of loss of confidence in the world financial system and a sudden stop of capital, which could affect Latin America. The second big risk is if something goes badly wrong in China and commodity prices would crash. Now, I think the more probable scenario is that we'll see 2 to 3 years of fairly slow growth in the world economy because of the problems of Europe, because of stagnation in the US, and because of the slowdown in China. And we'll see some slowing in commodity prices, but they'll still remain at relatively high levels. And what that adds up to is probably growth of 3 to 4% in Latin America instead of 5 to 6%. Of course, whenever one talks about Latin America, one is talking about lots of different places, and the average always conceals extremes. And one broad point is that South America does better out of high commodity prices than Mexico and Central America do, and that Mexico and Central America are more directly exposed to the US economy and have suffered more as a result in the last couple of years. But I would point out that actually I think Mexico will grow faster than Brazil this year and next, because its economy is quite resilient, it's getting a lot of foreign direct investment, it's benefiting from the fact that wages are going up in China, and Brazil is slowing for a series of reasons. But I think if one thinks about a rather tougher outside world, then clearly for Latin America to continue growing at 5 to 6%, which it needs to do to tackle its social problems, then it needs to raise its gain. And the underlying problem that it needs to address is the lack of productivity in its economies. These numbers come from a study done by the Inter-American Development Bank last year, which shows that had productivity in Latin America kept pace with that in the rest of the world over the last 50 years, Latin America would be 50% richer than it is today. There are a couple of saving graces. The record has improved a little bit in the last 20 years, and agriculture in many countries in Latin America is highly productive. But the big problem is that service businesses, which is where most Latin Americans work, show no productivity gains at all. Now, what explains this? A series of structural weaknesses. I would start with the fact that 1 Latin American in 2 still works in the informal economy. And informality, almost by definition, condemns you to, condemns a business to lack of scale, lack of the ability to innovate technologically, and so on. And informality remains a huge problem. It's the more years I spend looking at informality in Latin America, the more complex I think it is. And it's not just a question of property titles, important though they are. It's a cultural phenomenon as well as an economic and social phenomenon. But it's one that the region needs to deal with if it's to grow faster. Second big weakness is infrastructure. More has been invested, but a lot more is needed. The region only invests about half what it needs to be doing if it's to grow at 6% a year. Then thirdly, I would highlight education. Only in Chile, of all the Latin American countries, only in Chile has a majority of the workforce completed secondary education. And even those who stay at school are not learning as much as they should be learning. In all the PISA tests, which are the standardized international tests that some Latin American countries have taken part in the last few years, the Latin American countries come at the bottom. Now, they're competing there against mainly rich, developed countries, but also against places like China and Korea and so on. The one saving grace is that their results are improving, but they're improving from a low base. And linked to the poor quality of education is the lack of innovation in Latin American businesses. And both governments and the private sector need to spend more on research and development, and they need to link up their efforts. Another constraint, which I think is easing now, has been lack of credit. But I think there's another constraint which is not easing, which is the lack of competition. I mean, monopolies, both public and private, have tended to be as Latin American as margaritas or mojitos. And it requires a big effort of public policy to introduce more competition. And that, the last point there, I think, is government regulation. And although there have been some improvements in some places, there's still too much needless bureaucratic regulation which doesn't achieve anything. But all that said, the region is clearly much more resilient than it was in the past. And there's a lot of good things going on. And I would highlight particularly, actually, the growth of so-called multilatinas, Latin American multinationals, which move into neighboring countries typically and then go from there. And I think that's because they need to be quite competitive and innovative to be able to do that. They learn things by doing it, and also they inject competition when they arrive. Because if Latin America has historically suffered from crony capitalism, then if a company from next door comes in, at least it's somebody else's cronies, as it were. So I mean, you have a competition. So I think the big question for the next few years is what are the political implications of slower growth, if that's what we get. And I want to make half a dozen points about the politics in the region. A decade or so ago, the left came to power in many countries in the region during a so-called lost half-decade of economic stagnation. That, if you remember, was the time of the Argentine debt default, and problems in various Asian countries and Russia, which had a big knock-on effect in Latin America. So what happens now if we get slower growth? Do we get a move further to the left? Do we get a move to the right? Do we get more radicalism or less radicalism, on more nationalizations and less nationalizations? Well, I think the first thing to say is that there are several different lefts in Latin America. And actually for the audience for a business audience, which I think this audience is in part, I think perhaps the best way of illustrating the differences is just to show the flows of foreign direct investment. And you will see that in relation to the size of the economy, Argentina and Ecuador and Venezuela in particular are underrepresented there. And it's true that some governments take a different line towards foreign private investment than local private investment. But in general, foreign attitudes to foreign investment are a pretty good proxy for attitudes to private investment in general. And you see very big differences. And in both Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela all have governments to the left of center, and yet there are very big differences between them in their attitude to investment. Second point I'd make is that Chavismo, the political approach associated with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, as a continental project, which is how he conceived it, is in retreat. And that's, I think, because of the poor performance of Venezuela economically over the last 2 to 3 years, compared with the rest of the region. The fact that its social advances have turned out to be not as strong as the government said. For example, in the last UN Human Development Report, Peru has actually overtook Venezuela on human development indicators. And I think that retreat of Chavismo as a continental project is summed up by the fact that in Peru, Ollanta Humala, who 5 years ago ran as a Chavista, this year ran as a Lulista, ran as somebody who admires the Brazilian approach to things. I mean, I think Chavez still has 1 or 2 allies, and particularly Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, who will win the election on Sunday, I have no doubt. But he will win mainly because he has he's blessed with a completely incompetent and hopeless and unelectable opposition. Now, Hugo Chavez himself could win, of course, another term in Venezuela next year. I mean, we simply do not know whether he's going to make a full recovery from cancer or not. Whether or not he does, he could win next year, but he could lose. I mean, Venezuela is now, I think, 50-50. It's a 50-50 nation. So we will see. Clearly, what happens in Venezuela's election next September, will have big implications for the region. Thirdly, I think it's important to stress that moderate left-of-centre governments in many countries have achieved the enduring loyalty. Actually, let me take out the moderate there. I would say that actually centre-left governments in the region, and I'd include Venezuela in that, have achieved the enduring loyalty of an important segment of the poor in the region. And in many countries, that's because of conditional cash transfer programs like Bolsa Familia in Brazil or Oportunidades in Mexico. And of course, they're not a monopoly of the center-left. I mean, Mexico pioneered just as much as Brazil these schemes, in which poorer parents get a monthly stipend in return for their children going to school and getting health checks. And these programs have been very successful, I think, at reducing poverty, reducing inequality, and at setting a minimum, providing a minimum level of socioeconomic citizenship. I think the centre-right has actually been struggling a bit in Latin America in the last decade. I mean, in Mexico, the centre-right has won 2 elections, but it's found governing quite hard. It's found transforming the institutional structures of Mexico quite hard. And the centre-right in Chile is facing a quite difficult situation, the government in Chile, with the student demand for educational reforms. I think Colombia is an exception in this respect. I mean, I think Juan Manuel Santos, who, although he's an ally of President Uribe, and publicly praises President Uribe at every turn, while quietly doing something slightly different, is potentially a very successful centrist reformer. But I think that the right kind of is looking for a new agenda in Latin America. I mean, I think crime provides it. Crime is a very serious issue in many parts of the region. It's partly an externally generated problem because of the drug trade, but it's also a development issue, and it's an issue that has to be faced. Now, I think the right needs more than just crime as to put together a successful political agenda. And I think there are opportunities for the centre-right in this new lower middle class, with all the caveats that one should apply to that term. I think this group, it's clear, is very hostile to inflation. It's hostile to kind of economic adventurism. It's probably hostile to higher interest rates because a lot of them have a lot of debt. And they are demanding better public services. Now, in some countries, that demand for better public services ought to translate into an increase in tax revenues and more state provision, because you cannot have a modern country with a state that only collects 10% of GDP in tax revenue, as is the case in some Central American countries, for example. But on the other hand, if you go to Brazil, where tax revenues account for 38% of GDP, then I think you have growing discontent about the level of taxes and what you get from your taxes, which has not yet found political expression. I mean, in tomorrow's Economist, you'll see that we have the latest Latino Barometer poll, and it found amongst the Brazilian respondents that 96% thought that taxes were high or very high, and only 15% thought that they were well spent. So I think there's a political opportunity there down the road. I think many of the older generation amongst this new lower middle class share many of the attitudes of the poor, and they want things from the state. They want a paternalistic state, if you like. But I think many of the younger members of that social group, who are better educated than their parents, are much more market-oriented. And I think the Chilean protests at the moment, which have been going on for several months and which are very popular. I mean, you get all these photographs of masked anarchists chucking Molotov cocktails. That's not really the story. The real story is that there is a mass movement wanting an education system that provides equality of opportunity, and that has the backing of 70 to 80% of Chileans. And I think that's a demand the government will have to answer. Then there is the issue of the environment, which, and I'm sure John will talk a lot about how to conciliate local and national interests in natural resource development. But I would note that polling shows that while people in Europe and the US are less worried about climate change than they were a few years ago, basically because they've got too many other things to worry about at the moment, Latin Americans are becoming strikingly more worried about it. And that's partly a reflection of the fact the economies are getting much better, but it's also a reflection of the fact that people have been feeling the impact of climate change in Latin America very negatively in the form of terrible flooding in places like Colombia, parts of Brazil, Central America now, and so forth. To sum up, I think that governing will be more difficult in Latin America in the next few years than it has been in the last few. And I think that will put the accent on better public policy. And I think people who have just surfed the commodity wave, spending like there was no tomorrow, will be found out in the next few years. I think that it's clear that Latin America can be a relatively high growth area of the world in the next few years. It won't grow as fast as China or India because it's already middle income and it's much harder to grow than to grow fast. It ought to be able to grow as fast as South Korea, which is middle income as well, but it won't until it tackles its productivity gaps. I mean, the other big advantage that the region has is that, with the exception of Cuba, it is, of course, a region of democracies. And these democracies still have many imperfections, and they vary enormously, but many of them are moving forward in slowly building, and this is a slow job, it doesn't happen overnight, and people who promise it overnight never deliver it. They usually make it worse. It's a slow job of building stronger institutions and fighting and tackling corruption, for example, through strong institutions and free media. Another commercial. Sorry, Eduardo. We'll do one for Mexico. I hope, sometime, before too long. I do think that, actually, in many ways, when one looks at the region over the last 10 years, and when you're there, it's much more diverse than it looks from here. And Mexico and Brazil are different places, and they're a long way apart. But I do think, in a way, the story of the region in the last 10 years has been summed up by the rise of Brazil, which is felt beyond Brazil. And in a way, Lula has been the emblematic person of the last decade, not least because he didn't think that he was indispensable. And he didn't try and change the constitution to stay in power forever. And what he achieved during his 8 years in office was much more inclusive social policies, a much more inclusive democracy. It's true, he left an economy that was overheating, a state payroll that's too big, and that Brazil will have to tackle. But I think he sums up the progress that the region has made in the last 10 years. I think the next 10 years will require a different kind of leadership. It's going to require much more effective public policies to tackle some of these structural problems of low productivity and poor public services, which the region can now afford to tackle. So I would say that there are lots of opportunities. Latin America can look Europe in the face with considerable pride, but at the same time, and I think the biggest danger facing the region is complacency, the notion that it's got it all right, because I think there are things that it still needs to do. Thank you very much.